Welcome back. In this short segment, we're going to take a look at the blood plasma. And from this, I'm going to want you to be able to define the major components of the plasma, specifically looking at the major proteins involved and what their roles are, and then understand how plasma is involved in regulating our blood pressure. So let's take a look at some of these proteins. Now remember that plasma is made up of 55% of your blood, and of that 55%, 91.5 or 92% of that is going to be made up of water. So water is the main component of your blood. And then you're going to have a lot of other stuff in there. You're going to have dissolved solutes. And for that, we're looking at all these guys here. So primarily you're looking at different nutrients and electrolytes. So that's going to be your potassiums, your sodiums, your chlorides, and then your gases. And so those gases obviously are going to be O2 and carbon dioxide. There's also a lot of other stuff in there. You're going to have different vitamins that are going to be dissolved in the water, the different waste products that are being sent out from the cells after they're doing their metabolic processes. All of these little things that are in there that are just floating around dissolved in the blood are part of that plasma as dissolved solutes, or you'll also hear me refer to them as inclusions. And then we've got our proteins. And our proteins make up about 7% total of that blood plasma volume. And of those proteins, there's a few that I want you to be really familiar with. The first one is albumin. And albumin makes up the majority of all the proteins, 54%. And what this does is it creates an osmotic pressure within the blood. And if you remember, when we were talking about osmotic pressure before, that's the pressure that's pulling water into the system. So we talked about it thinking about a cell, an osmotic pressure in a cell. Well, now we're talking about it within the vessel, within that artery or vein. And if you have a bunch of solutes in there, if you have a bunch of proteins and red blood cells and other things, then those proteins are going to be causing an osmotic pressure pulling blood into those arteries and veins. If you didn't have these albumin in there, you wouldn't have the osmotic pressure, and all the fluid, the water would be leaking out via the capillaries into the interstitial fluid or into the peritoneum, into any of the cavities, and you would get massive amounts of edema, and the blood pressure would drop, and you would end up dying, and because you couldn't maintain that blood pressure. So these proteins are critically important, and albumin is the primary one that they're going to pump into you if your proteins are low. Another important one that we have are these globulins. And globulins here, there's a few different types of globulins. They make up a little over a third of the proteins. The first two are going to be alpha and beta globulins, sorry. And these guys are primarily going to be used to transport lipids and fat-soluble vitamins throughout the blood. So a lot of these vitamins can't dissolve in the blood by themselves, but they need little carriers, and that's what these globulins are going to do. And then there are gamma globulins. And gamma globulins are antibodies. We're going to spend a whole big section in this blood here when we start looking at antibodies. You're going to see, and these are going to be your Igs. So there's going to be IgA, IgD, IgE, IgE, a bunch of different types of gamma globulins. They're going to be used to ward off infections in your body, and they all have different purposes for that. And we'll talk about those a little bit later. Third, there's fibrinogen, and fibrinogen is going to be used primarily for blood clotting. So that's going to be the important thing here. It's not typically in an active form until it needs to be, but it's going to be floating around in the blood ready to go, and it's going to be the net that basically makes that blood clot. We're going to see that the platelets are going to go to plug the injured tissue immediately, and then we're going to activate through this big long cascade this fibrinogen that's going to actually end up making the clot. So that's really important. And then down around 1%, we're going to have plasminogen. And plasminogen is going to be used to break up the clots. So it's going to be used on this fibrinogen later, once we need to get that clot out and the tissue beneath it has been healed. Lastly, there's a lot of other regulatory and other types of proteins. So we're going to look at, you're going to see a bunch of different hormones, all your enzymes that are floating around in there. And then, of course, you're going to have your pro-hormones and pro-enzymes that are basically proteins floating around in this plasma as well. And they're going to be what's acting on your body. That pretty much takes care of the proteins. So the other important part of the plasma is we know that this is going to be the important part of regulating blood pressure. And I just mentioned how it's those albumins, it's a primary part of contributing to the osmotic pressure in the blood. Well, the blood has to make pressure throughout your body to sustain all of your organs. So that blood pressure is measured by osmoreceptors. And you've heard this term before. We've kind of just vaguely mentioned that osmoreceptors are going to be located in the hypothalamus. So we've got these osmoreceptors. They're measuring the osmolality of the blood. And the higher the osmolality, remember, if you have a greater concentration, that also means you have less water or less plasma. It's all going to be in relation to all these red blood cells primarily, because that's making up the other 45% of the blood. So when you're dehydrated, you're going to have a higher osmolality in the blood. Dehydrated. So in that case, if you have a high osmolality, which means you have fluid loss, hypothalamus is going to respond to that by releasing antidiuretic hormone, ADH. And that ADH is a hormone. It's going to go into the bloodstream. And you can see here it's going to the collecting duct of the nephron of the kidney. And we'll spend a couple lectures looking at the kidney and the nephron and how that all works. But what that's going to do is it's going to pull water out of the collecting duct, and it's going to bring water back into your system. Because remember, this collecting duct is going to end up creating urine. So if you're pulling water out of your urine, you're bringing it back into your body. And that's one of the ways that your brain, your hypothalamus, is going to regulate your blood pressure by controlling the amount of water directly through these osmoreceptors. And that concludes this section.